Hi, first graders. Today we're going to learn about fairy tales, which is our newest IB unit that we're going to start. So we are moving on from the plants and animals that we were learning about, and now we're going to learn about fairy tales. And fairy tales are a lot of fun because you have probably heard several fairy tales before. Just thinking of a few, I'm thinking of Goldilocks, Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. All of these are fairy tales. Typically, a fairy tale is a story that has been told over and over and over for many, many years. And so we are starting to see a lot of fairy tales that are being retold and kind of have a different spin on it. Maybe they're changing the characters a bit, but it's still the same idea of that fairy tale that's been told for years and years and years. So we are going to be learning a lot about these fairy tales. One of the things that we're going to talk about, especially today, is some of the things that make a fairy tale a fairy tale. And those are going to be some of the elements that you find in a fairy tale. Okay, so I made a poster behind me of all the elements that you would see in a story that makes it a fairy tale. And if it has these things or some of these things, then chances are it is a fairy tale. Now, one of the things that's funny about fairy tales is it doesn't have to include a fairy. It's not just because it's called a fairy tale. A lot of the stories don't actually have a fairy in them, okay? So just keep that in mind. I want to show you this poster that I made, though, and talk about some of those elements that are included in a fairy tale. So some of the things that you'll see in a fairy tale is you might see a good character and then an evil character. So thinking about some of those stories where there's a good guy and a bad guy, that's kind of the same in fairy tales too. The other thing that fairy tales might have in them is royalty. That means like a king or a queen or a princess or a prince. And then they might have somebody who's poor. And this word says poverty. So that might be like the story Jack and the Beanstalk, where Jack and his mother were very poor. And that's this word poverty. Okay, so royalty and poverty. There's magic in some fairy tales. A lot of fairy tales have magic. Castles. One thing that's funny about fairy tales is a lot of times the characters are in groups of three, like the Three Little Pigs or Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So we might notice that as we read some of the fairy tales. Also, fairy tales will have a problem and then they solve the problem. And once they solve the problem, it typically has a happy ending because they've resolved the problem. And so everything is good at the end of the story, okay? We're going to talk more about this word, personification. This is a way that authors will make fairy tales and they'll give characters some human-like qualities, but we'll talk more about that. You might see elves, dwarves like Snow White, or giants or wizards, going back to kind of having that magic in the story too. A lot of times your fairy tales are going to start with once upon a time or a long, long time ago. And that means that this fairy tales are typically set in the past, so a long time ago. They're going to be make-believe stories, so pretend stories, fiction stories, just like we're learning about in our writing unit about fiction writing. And then one of the really important things about a fairy tale is it typically has a lesson. It's going to teach you a lesson or a value from reading that story. So you might have heard me say this before as what's the author's message? What was the message in that story? Or what was the author trying to teach you? And so we're going to read some fairy tales together, and we're going to decide what was the author trying to teach us? What was the value or the lesson in that story? And there are a lot of different ideas. So as I read some fairy tales to you, you can talk about this at home with your families and see what you guys think that the message or the lesson was that the author was trying to teach us. Okay, I want to read a story to you. I'm going to share it on my screen so that we should be able to see it together at the same time. And then I would like to see if any of those things that we've noticed are showing up, any of these elements are showing up in this fairy tale. Does anybody know what fairy tale this is? This is Goldilocks. Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Just like I said, characters in groups of three. So this is one of those stories where the characters are going to be in a group of three. Let's read it and see what happens to Goldilocks. You might have heard this story before. Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Once upon a time, there lived a youngster named Goldilocks. One day she went for a walk in the woods. She found a house and knocked on the door. No one answered, so she walked in. Do you think she should have walked in without asking? 3 bowls of porridge sat on the table. She tasted the porridge from the big bowl. This porridge is too hot, she said. She tasted the porridge from the medium bowl. This porridge is too cold, she said. She tasted the porridge from the small bowl. This porridge is just right, she said, and she ate it all up. Well, there she is. You can see that the illustrator used these marks here, these kind of curly lines to show that that porridge over there was very hot. That one has a lot of steam coming off of it, but this little one was just right. Goldilocks saw 3 chairs. She sat in the big chair. This chair is too big, she said. She sat in the medium chair. This chair is still too big, she said. She sat in the small chair. This chair is just right, she said. Then the chair broke. Oh well, she said. She didn't even feel badly about breaking that chair, did she? Goldilocks was sleepy. She climbed the stairs looking for a bed. She lay down on the big bed, but it was too hard. She lay down on the medium bed, but it was too soft. She lay down on the small bed, and it was just right. The owners of the house returned. They did not like what they saw. Someone's been eating my porridge, said Papa Bear. Someone's been eating my porridge, said Mama Bear. Someone's been eating my porridge, said Baby Bear, and it's all gone. Oh, look at their faces. Papa Bear is having a wondering, who could have done this? Poor Baby Bear. No more porridge for him. The hungry bears saw their chairs. Someone has been sitting in my chair, said Papa Bear. Someone's been sitting in my chair, said Mama Bear. Someone's been sitting in my chair, said Baby Bear, and it's broken. Poor Baby Bear, no porridge and a broken chair. The hungry, angry bears went upstairs. Someone's been sleeping in my bed, said Papa Bear. Someone's been sleeping in my bed, said Mama Bear. Someone's been sleeping in my bed, said Baby Bear, and she's still there. Shh, said Goldilocks. When Goldilocks saw the 3 hungry, angry bears, she jumped out of bed. She ran all the way home. Goldilocks never again went to the home of the 3 bears. The end. So what do you think about that story? Let's go back to the beginning of the story. I am wondering what type of elements there are in this story, like we have on the chart behind me. So we already talked about that. One of the things that I noticed right away was this story has characters in groups of 3. Did this story have any magic? Not really. So that's just something you might find in a fairy tale, but you might not too. This story did have this word up here, personification. So that means that you are giving a character who's not a human some human-like qualities. So for example, the bears in this story are not humans, yet they act like humans. So that's called personification. The bears in this story wear clothes, they can talk, they're acting like they're humans, but they're actually bears. So that's called personification. The other thing that I did notice way at the beginning of the story is it started off with the word, just like many fairy tales do, it started off right here, once upon a time. And that is something that you'll notice in a lot of fairy tales. This was a make-believe story, so that is one element that it has of a fairy tale. This is a fiction story. It's just made up, right? Because there's no talking bears who wear clothes and live in houses and eat porridge. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk to you about is, what was the lesson in this story? What do you think the author is trying to teach us after hearing this story about Goldilocks? Do you think that Goldilocks was following some rules? Let's look here on the first page. It says right here at the bottom, no one answered, so she walked in. Is that using your manners? Is that very polite to just go into somebody's house when you don't have permission? I don't think so. So that could be the message. The message could be that you always need to ask permission. Okay, before you do something, before you go into somebody's house, you always should ask first. The other thing is she ate Baby Bear's porridge and then she broke Baby Bear's chair and all she said was, "Oh well." So she didn't even feel sorry. She didn't even feel bad. So that could be a message too, is that sometimes we might make a mistake, like breaking a chair on accident, but we should always apologize or tell that person that we're sorry. So in these fairy tales, there are messages like that, that the author's trying to teach you. So in this story, I think maybe this story you should ask permission, you should use your manners, and you should apologize if you make a mistake or do something wrong. Because at the very end of the story, she just ran away. She didn't even wake up and say, "Oops, sorry for sleeping in your house and eating your food." She just ran away and didn't say anything. So maybe she should have apologized for what she had done. Alrighty, well that was our first fairy tale and our first lesson on fairy tales. We're going to read more of these, and like I said, we're going to talk more about these elements of a fairy tale that I have behind me here. So if you read any fairy tales on Raz Kids, or if you read any fairy tales on Epic, you can start thinking about if those stories have some magic or a castle or a prince or a queen, some of those elements that can be found in a fairy tale. I hope you're having a great day and that you guys have a great weekend. Bye.